To Lisa and folks at, whoa, this is moving with me, CLPR, for inviting me to introduce Professor John Rogers tonight to say nice things about you. So John is, you're here because you know, right, that John is a phenomenal researcher. But what I think distinguishes him the most is that I think he epitomizes what it means to be a publicly engaged scholar. He writes for both academic and general audiences, but he maintains the intellectual nuance of the work regardless of where he is speaking or writing, and I think that is terrifically difficult to do. And I think he's able to do that, to execute that so well, because not only is his work done in collaboration with communities who are most affected by the issues he investigates, he's able to do it because he himself is an active advocate for equitable schooling. He's in the trenches in equity litigation and organizing, and I think perhaps most importantly, he provides a really wonderful example and much needed example for students about how to do the work that he does with rigor and integrity and great care. And so often in graduate schools of education, we get students who come in deeply committed to changing things and quickly get talked out of the change agenda through our curriculum and through our methods. And I think John shows these students how they can adhere to those commitments in ways that will also enhance their abilities as researchers and scholars. I was lucky enough to overlap with John just for a bit when I was a doctoral student at UCLA, but I was able to attend a couple of talks he gave on a range of topics, most memorably for me on Dewey and education. I think it was the first time I'd ever heard anyone talk about Dewey, and even though I was in a school of education. And I think in many ways John's work takes Dewey to places Dewey didn't get to go, and I think that's what makes it particularly powerful. More recently, I had the opportunity to carpool with John from Denver to Boulder, where we were both attending a meeting, and just had this wonderful, very free-flowing conversation about neoliberalism and inequality and parenting and the state of public universities. And I think what that conversation for me crystallizes about John is how much he reads, how conversant he is in just a multitude of policy issues, and how generous he is with his ideas. He was also exceedingly patient as I botched his very clear directions on his iPad and made us turn around several times on the highway. So thank you, John, for not getting mad at me about that, because that was my only job in the car. So anyway, so his official accomplishments, here they go. So as you know, he's an associate professor of education at UCLA and directs UCLA's Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access. He's also the faculty co-director for UCLA's Principal Leadership Institute, and his research interests involve the distribution and adequacy of educational opportunities across California schools, as well as strategies to promote the democratization of knowledge and power in urban schools and communities. He founded IDEA with Jeannie Oakes in 2000. He works through IDEA with scholars, students, educators, and community members toward the center's mission of making high-quality public schooling and successful college preparation a reality for all Los Angeles youth. He also works on UC ACORN and IDEA's annual California Education Opportunity Report, which reports on the distribution of educational opportunities across California public schools, considering whether these opportunities are distributed equally and if California students receive comparable learning conditions to students across the nation. They often do not. It's often unequal. So in addition to doing this work, he has a recently published book, Public Engagement for Public Education, Joining Forces to Revitalize Democracy and Equalize Schools. This book provides critical insight from a variety of contributors on the way community members and parents can work together to make schools better and more equitable. And I know I personally lean quite heavily on John's work across topics that I am pursuing in my own research, and so for that I'm very, very grateful and very excited to hear you talk today, John. So.
Thank you, Lauren. That was lovely and worth coming up to Berkeley just for the introduction. And thanks, Lisa, for inviting me. So, as Lauren was saying, the center I direct, UCLA's Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access, works in collaboration with community organizations across the state to try to provide them with information so that they can advocate more effectively for equitable schooling, for more just schooling here in California. And at times we also provide them with support so that they can conduct their own investigations, so that they can look at what's going on in their schools, so that they can explore policies that are playing out. And through some of that work, I've had a chance to see just how effective some community-based groups, in particular community organizing groups and youth organizing groups, can be in winning new policies in Los Angeles, across the state. And I think a lot of the research on community organizing has tried to establish whether or not community organizing in education can be successful or not. I want to pick up on two other streams of outcomes that can flow out of particularly youth organizing. One is the capacity of youth organizing groups to build power, build social networks, build social capital, build power within the communities that they're organizing. And secondly, their ability to develop the civic capacity of their members. So develop the ability of young people who are members of these organizations to be more powerful in the future, to develop their civic skills. So that's the broad topic I'm going to engage today. Let me begin with a picture that was taken almost exactly 3 years ago. This is 5 days before the 2008 election. East Los Angeles. It's a rally that was convened by an organization called Inner City Struggle that organizes across East Los Angeles. They focus on 4 different high schools in East Los Angeles. They work across various different East LA communities. This was a rally. It was part of a general Get Out the Vote campaign that they were engaged in. And I don't know if it's how easy it is to see, but there's some high school students here in the front row who have what are meant to be bars in front of them. And they're also dressed up, these 3 or 4 students are dressed up to be doctors or lawyers or teachers or scientists. And it was a little clearer at the reality that was pointed out. So let me pick up on the speech that Maria Brennis, who at that point was executive director and remains executive director, gave. So Maria said, "We need to make sure that this future can become a reality." The future she's referring to these young people dressed up as professionals. "We cannot afford to lock up our future. We cannot afford to slash more from our education budget. We have worked too hard to improve our communities to take more steps back." Now, Brennis then called on the voters that were there, and there were more people surrounding, to both reject 2 of the propositions that were on the ballot in 2008. Some of you may remember Proposition 6, Proposition 9, both of which related to incarceration. Proposition 6 would have increased youth incarceration. Proposition 9 was going to extend the period of incarceration. And then she was encouraging as well people to go out and vote for the local bond measure that was going to bring more money into school facilities. After Maria stepped down, another student who you can't see here, Jonathan Perez, who had just graduated from high school, stepped up to the mic. He also was a member of Inner City Struggle. And Jonathan said, "As a high school graduate who almost didn't make it to graduation, I know the importance of education as the deciding factor in whether students succeed or not." He went on to note that California ranked first in the amount of money it was spending on its jails and near last in per pupil expenditures. And he said, "When you have a school with over 5,000 students, and when you have to sit there for the first 3 weeks of class on the floor without a book, and when you don't have science labs, it becomes harder to compete." And he again called on the voters present to reject 6 and 9 and to vote for this other measure. Now, we can see in this picture as well, there's a couple purple t-shirted folks. And their presence speaks to some of the power building that had gone on. There's SEIU members from a few different SEIU locals. So this local youth organizing group was able to bring in union power into this rally. Also there is Jorge Lopez. Well, now I can't see, but he's off to the side in the hat. He's a teacher leader at the local school. And he both is the faculty sponsor of the Mecha Club and of the United Students Club, which is the inner city struggle club on campus, the official club of this youth organizing group. Also there is Lester Garcia, who now runs the Boyle Heights Learning Collaborative, a civic organization in East LA, but was a high school student at Roosevelt High School and a member of Inner City Struggle, and then a staff member, and then moved on to this other work. You also see in this picture some folks from the Community Coalition, a youth organizing group in South Los Angeles. They were reaching out beyond just East LA. What you can't see is reporters who are also there from the local NPR, from the LA Times. You also can't see one of the next speakers, who's Monica Garcia, the president of the school board, who, after she spoke, told me, I lost Monica. Oh, here she is. Who told me afterwards, speaking of the inner city struggle students, they know you are not just a person that got elected. You are somebody who's supposed to work for them. I always get a sense of being accountable to them. Now, in addition to showcasing some of the power of this youth organizing group, we also can at least imagine the civic learning opportunities that are unfolding both for the young people that are there and for the young people that were involved in other activities related to the election within the inner city struggle. Hector Flores, who's the guy holding the bullhorn and one of the lead youth organizers in the inner city struggle, told me right after the rally that any election when you're doing youth organizing provides an opportunity to do political education. Now, when Hector talks about political education, he means something different than what he sees anyway in the local government class at the high school. Hector says, we're redefining what politics means. Politics has been so structurally defined as Democrat and Republican conversations. No. Politics is anything that affects you as a human being, you as a community member, you as a student, you as somebody affected by the quality of life in your neighborhood. That is politics. So when Hector engages young people in inner city struggle and political education, it means talking about how power is distributed, how it's enacted, how it can be transformed. It means talking about the relationship between racial inequality and what's going on in the schools. It means talking about social justice and incarceration. It means talking about poverty. That, for him, is politics. That's the opportunity that the election opened up as he engaged young people in discussions about electoral politics. So today, I want to kind of elaborate these points and speak to the ways in which inner city struggle and other youth organizing groups both build power and enable young people to develop new understandings and new capacities to engage in political life and civic life in ways that I think, at least in their best moments, transform the meaning of power and transform the meaning of democracy. Okay. So I'm going to start by saying a little bit about civic inequality that prevails, that kind of creates a context in which it's really important how youth organize. And then I want to talk about youth organizing and how it's emerged in the last 3 decades or so as an important site of learning, but in particular civic learning. And then I'm going to use inner city struggle as a way to talk about building power and learning democracy. I'm going to describe 2 different cases. One is the case of Inner City Struggle's campaign for college access in Los Angeles, where they joined many other groups. And then I'm going to talk about their work in the 2008 election a little bit more, and some work of other youth organizing groups in the state. And I'm going to close with just a few thoughts about some work that Veronica Triquez, who you're going to hear from, or some of you who come back will hear from in a couple weeks. She and I are doing where we're looking at the effects of youth organizing on young people as they enter adulthood. So people who were in youth organizing groups in high school, what sort of outcomes does it seem to have? Okay, so let me start off with inequality and civic participation. Oops, go back. There's more and more work, much of it being done here at Berkeley, that is emerging about the ways in which civic participation has been depressed over the last 40 years, that you see voting rates going down, participation in civic associations, But you also see growing inequality in civic life. And so if we look at social class or race, we see differences in voting rates, we see differences in participation in political associations, we even see differences in the levels at which people are engaging in protest. Now, whether or not this is changing in the last few months, I think is an interesting question. I don't know, but there has been these long-standing patterns of inequality that led the American Political Science Association to say a few years ago in their task force report, today the voices of American citizens are raised and heard unequally. The privileged participate more than others and are increasingly well organized to press their demands on government. Public officials, in turn, are much more responsive to the privileged than to average citizens and the least affluent. Citizens with lower or moderate incomes speak with a whisper that's lost to the ears of inattentive government officials, while the advantaged roar with clarity and consistency that policymakers readily hear and routinely follow. Now, this inequality doesn't just play out generally across the political spectrum, it also plays out for young people. So one of the things we've seen in the last few decades is lower levels of civic engagement for youth, and levels of engagement that seem to be unequal by race and by social class. And we saw this in the last election in terms of, or last set of elections in terms of voting, where college-educated youth voted at almost twice the rate of non-college youth. The distinctions in voting by race are less clear in terms of patterns. In the last election, African American youth voted at higher rates than other groups. But nonetheless, there are broad patterns of inequality in the civic engagement of youth. And some people have pointed out as well that the civic knowledge that young people bring to bear is unequally held. So on the NAEP civics test, we see lower levels of performance for African American youth and Latino youth than white and Asian youth. Now, some people like Joe Kahn here have pointed out that these inequalities in civic learning and in civic engagement are strongly tied to unequal patterns of civic learning opportunities inside of schools and outside of schools. So Joe has done extensive work which suggests that Latino students, African American students, low-income students, on average have fewer key civic learning opportunities, such as the opportunity to engage in discussions in the classroom about current events, than other young people, and that this is consequential for the sort of civic engagement, civic participation, civic commitments that they develop over time. We also see other research that suggests that there are differential civic learning opportunities outside of school. So youth organizing offers one site to think about equalizing civic engagement and civic learning opportunities. One definition of youth organizing is a process for developing within a neighborhood or community a base of young people committed to altering power relationships and creating meaningful institutional change. Youth organizing really has emerged in the last 3 decades as groups in the 1980s began to try to respond in many urban areas to patterns of growing economic inequality, patterns of social disinvestment, and increased incarceration rates. And you saw activism emerge in the late 80s and into the early 90s, where there was growing efforts in cities to bring young people together, to argue for different sorts of policies, and to try to insert the voices of young people of color into policy debates. In that way, both push against the policies, but also suggest that public policy needed to represent young people of color in different sorts of ways that were not that were highlighting their strengths as opposed to having negative attributes put on them. The initial efforts around youth organizing highlighted efforts to try to engage young people in political consciousness raising, and then often, particularly in California, were tied to state initiatives that were reactionary in purpose. So the state initiatives like Proposition 209 and others that tried to eliminate affirmative action, or do away with bilingual education, or restrict the rights of non-citizens. All of these became sites of counter-resistance from youth organizing groups that were emerging to try to do battle against these initiatives. Now, oftentimes, when youth got together in the context of these campaigns, their organizing and energy fizzled out a little bit once the campaigns were over. But as the 90s went forward, there were more efforts to try to sustain the work that had begun during the campaigns. And so nonprofit organizations were established, staff was brought in, and there was more of an effort to try to think towards longer-term planning. And in this way, these groups that had begun kind of haphazardly began to form and begin to have sustained effort over time. By the early 2000s, you saw hundreds of such groups around the country, particularly in the larger cities. And their size ranged widely. And oftentimes people looking at youth organizing focus on core membership, the people that are there, say, 3 times a week or so. And then they look at active members, people that participate a couple of times a year, and then how many people can be mobilized. So in some groups you would have core membership of 60 or 100. You might have active membership like an inner city struggle of maybe 600 youth. And then you may be able to mobilize 1,000 or 2,000 youth at any given event. Most of these youth organizing groups would meet after school. Sometimes they also met during the school time, and I'll talk a little bit about that later with Inner City Struggle. So youth organizing groups have 2 different ways of thinking about change that are embedded within this quote by Mark Warren, where he says, youth organizing trains young people in community organizing advocacy and helps them use these skills to alter power relations and create meaningful institutional change in their communities. So one approach to change is kind of the long-term approach, which is youth development, that youth organizing seeks to develop the capacity of young people over time to be more powerful. The second approach is more tied to the Alinsky tradition of community organizing, and it's to bring masses of people together, large groups of people together, for strategic action. Sometimes in the context of campaigns, there's relationship building with different institutional actors and key stakeholders. Sometimes there's a variety of different direct actions that youth organizing groups engage in, from petitions to marches to protests, that are seeking either to establish their presence in numbers or to press in a moral way, to make moral claims about what should happen, or simply to disrupt things so that there will be a reconsideration of existing policies. So youth organizing can be seen as a very powerful site of learning, and in particular of civic learning. And these 4 different elements of youth organizing are all elements that we would look to in any learning site, whether it be in theory a classroom or any other context for learning. So they tend to be voluntary sites, which means that young people are invited into the groups. And when young people are invited in, it means that they can choose to come in or not, and they can choose to stay or not. And so it's very important then for youth organizing groups to be relevant to young people and to give them a sense of personal power, so that they have a reason to come and a reason to stay. They also tend to be critical in the sense that they try to develop young people's sense of the relationship between their everyday experience and structural inequalities that play out. So one activity that a few organizing groups that I know of use is to do community walks, where they will map out what's happening in one neighborhood and then go to another neighborhood, oftentimes with a different socioeconomic dynamic, and map out what's going on there. And they may look at what the billboards are saying, they may look at the amount of green space, etc. But they're trying to have young people look at their everyday experience in new ways that are highlighting the structural inequalities that are playing out. A third element of youth organizing is that young people are engaged in real-world problem solving, oftentimes in the context of campaigns. And that means that young people have a chance to investigate, to identify problems, to think about what evidence they want to marshal, to think about who they need to connect with, this sort of investigation and real-world problem solving stretches their understanding because there's no certainty that they're going in with, and so the very uncertainty of real-world problems makes for a cognitively rich learning environment. And then finally, youth organizing sites are developmental, and there's a couple different elements to this. One is that because youth organizing sites seek to enable young people over time to become more and more powerful, there's a strong emphasis on participatory decision making. Inner City Struggle, the group I started off with, has a saying that they not only say but try to enact. And the saying is that any young person that walks through our doors is a potential executive director someday. Now, when you deeply believe that, you're going to treat that young person in a very different sort of way than if you see them as someone to mobilize, right? Mm-hmm. You see this person as someone whose capacity we need to develop. And so there's a constant process of giving them more and more responsibility, but doing that in a way where you're really scaffolding the activities that they're engaged in. So youth organizing groups tend to offer young people lots of opportunities to make decisions, to participate in decision making, but it doesn't mean that older youth who are participating or adults go away. It means that they play a facilitative role, a mentoring role, a role where they're trying to enable young people gradually to become more and more central to the process. The other developmental component, which I think is really important here, is that not most, but all youth organizing groups anyway, who've participated in community scans, say that they provide young people with a variety of developmental supports, from tutoring to help with problems that they're having, accessing health care, other services for their families. Youth organizing groups recognize that young people struggle oftentimes to make it through their daily lives, need help in navigating their pathway to adulthood, and so they provide them with this support. And as I was suggesting before, there was a scan done in 2010 of 160 youth organizing groups in the United States, and every last one of them said that they were providing these developmental supports to young people. So, do this real quickly, but this typology suggests kind of the array of different civic outcomes that we can look to for youth organizing groups. And the typology draws distinctions between categories that are far more fluid than are suggested by these boxes. But we can think about youth organizing groups both developing civic knowledge and skills and civic identity, right? And these civic identities embody knowledge and skills. So these are more fluid than that, but I think heuristically it's helpful to think about these two different categories. And then whether we're thinking about civic knowledge and skills or civic identity, it's important to note that youth organizing groups are both trying to enable young people to participate more powerfully in the civic institutions we have, and simultaneously seeking to transform those institutions. And for youth organizing groups, that's not a contradiction. Because they're both extremely pragmatic and they are very ideological at the same time. They bring those two elements together. And so there's a set of outcomes that we can think about associated with knowledge and skills participating in existing institutions, like gathering, analyzing, and reporting data. There's also transformative knowledge and skills, such as understanding a schema for social change. And similarly, we can think about civic identities that young people need to be able to interact with state officials and civic leaders, like the school board president I was suggesting before. But they also, over time, embrace a sense of solidarity with others who are oppressed. That becomes part of this civic development process. So you want to keep this in mind as I begin now to go through these two different cases of civic outcomes. So the first case is of the A through G campaign, or the College Access Campaign in California. As many of you probably already know, A through G are the courses that students need to take in California public schools to make them eligible for the California state system or the UC system. So before I get to the actual campaign, let me just build up to it with a couple comments on how inner city struggle came into being. So in the early 1990s, a group called Inner City Struggle was formed in order to address increasing violence in East Los Angeles. And over time, throughout the 1990s, the organization gradually morphed from a group that was focused on the symptoms of violence to thinking about the root causes of violence. And one of the primary root causes of violence that it highlighted was unequal access to meaningful opportunities to learn within the public schools, which in East LA at that time were, and still, but particularly at that time, were extraordinarily overcrowded and under-resourced. So in the early 2000s, they developed a storefront community center, and Maria Brenes, who, when she said this, was the associate director, talked about the fact that she saw young people historically having been catalysts for change. They have a lot of energy and an eye for understanding what's wrong with society, in part because they are the most impacted by the problems. So that's the potential. But she also then went on to say, although many young people know what the problems are, they haven't been taught what they can do to change the problems that they see. And so an organizing group that provided support and scaffolding to young people that would give them a sense of how to respond to these problems and give them the power and capacity to do so was what Inner City Struggle sought to become. And it tried to do this by providing civic learning opportunities across a few different domains. One was the United Students Club. So I think there's a certain genius in this which suggests how youth organizing groups sometimes try to use public institutions. They said the public schools, our local public high schools, already have this structure where they have clubs. So we're going to use that. And we're going to create what we call a United Students Club at our local high schools, where we'll get a faculty sponsor and the students will meet. And so now each of the 4 different high schools that they organize in, and a couple of the middle schools too, have these United Students or United Students Junior Clubs for the middle schools. And in these clubs, students come once a week. During an educational justice week each year, they have big rallies. They use music, they use youth popular culture as a way to attract in young people, and then engage them in talking about what the problems and issues they're facing and how they might respond. So that's the school level piece. Then young people come during the week, after school or on weekends, to Inner City Struggle's offices. And one of the things that they do there is have a series of workshops. So the Strike School curriculum, or the Strike School Academy, is a 15-week set of workshops that young people engage in that walk them through different topics such as globalization, white supremacy, colonialism. And they also talk about historical struggles for change and what's been effective, what's not been effective. This quote from Maria Brenes I think kind of speaks to how the everyday problems of young people get situated in a broader perspective. She says, when we talk about locked bathrooms, they're able to make the connections to the historical context. So it's not just a locked bathroom, it's something bigger than that. It's something about racial inequality and how it's playing out in our community. In addition to the Strike School curriculum, there's also a whole other curriculum which they call the Media Collective, which provides young people with information about how to produce their own media, how the mainstream media works, and the problematic images it portrays, so that they become more sophisticated, and it also provides them with tools so that they can speak to reporters in more effective ways. One quote from Inner City Struggle member who had gone through some of these activities, she says, "I went from being used to living in these conditions and not caring to realizing and being aware of how bad our school and community is to wanting to do something about it. Now my passion is to help people." So the most powerful learning that occurs within the context of youth organizing groups is in the process of campaign work. Inner City Struggle, when I first met them, first began interacting with the group in 2002, were focused in on very local struggles, very local campaigns. So in 2002, they were involved in a campaign to change the tardy policy in one school, which was significant. It was exactly what was affecting young people that came out of their conversations with them. The school was was not only giving penalties, but ticketing students and their families for the fact that the bus system was not getting the kids to school on time. So they changed that. They moved on then to a broader campaign where they ended up being able to create the force that led to the building of the first new high school in East LA in 70 years. Now, out of that struggle, they began to ask the question, well, what do we want this high school to be like? And so they initiated a listening campaign with students and with parents, and that's how they began to have a parent component to inner city struggle that's been growing since. So they asked people, what do we want from our school? And increasingly, they heard about the importance of college access. Now, this didn't surprise them. It had been a topic of discussion, but students and parents were saying we need to have more access to college prep classes. We want our school to be a school that's going to lead us to college, and they knew this was not happening in the schools that were prevailing at the time. Now, as they were making this case, young people in South LA were talking about the same thing in the Community Coalition, and a few other organizations around LA were having this conversation. And so those groups got together and built an alliance called Communities for Educational Equity that not only included youth organizing groups, but some community-based groups and some mainstream civic groups like the United Way of Los Angeles. And they said, we're going to have a broad strategic campaign that's including young people, including adults, to change the policies. One of Inner City Struggle's first contributions to this was to connect with their local school board member who they had established relationships with over the last few years, having regular meetings with Jose Huizar. And they encouraged him to put forward a resolution, which he did, saying that the default curriculum in the Los Angeles schools was going to be a college prep curriculum. So no longer would college prep be offered in one part of the city and not be offered in schools in other parts of the city. Well, when they first put this, when Jose Huizar first proposed this resolution, there was one vote that was supported, his own, out of the 7 potential votes in the LAUSD. So they knew that they needed to take some strategic action. This chart, which was developed by the groups, suggests the sort of sophisticated analysis they brought to bear to change those dynamics. And this is what's called a power map. So the power map from bottom to top looks at how salient different issues were, and from left to right looks at who's on their side. So this is their side, and as you move to the opposite side, it's groups or organizations that were opposed. And one of the understandings that came out of doing this strategic analysis was, A, they needed to neutralize the business community because in a statewide effort to affect a through G for all, the business community and particularly vocational education interests fought back against it and killed the bill. So they knew that they needed to neutralize the business community and maybe labor. And then they also knew that they somehow needed to change popular understandings, which were that young people in East LA, for the most part, didn't want to go to college and wanted to focus on high school graduation. And so to the extent that that idea, that understanding prevailed, they knew that they had no way to win over these other board members. So they began a campaign that ran across a number of different domains, all of which engaged youth in deep ways. One thing that the Inner City Struggle students did was that they did a survey in the 2 largest high schools, Roosevelt and Garfield, where they collected 3,000 surveys across those 2 schools. So a huge number of young people involved. And they asked the young people about their aspirations, and more than 90% said they wanted to go to college. They asked them, who encourages you to go to college? 3/4 said that the primary actors encouraging them to go to college were their parents. Those 2 facts, the fact that young people wanted to go to college and that it was their parents that were pushing it, that became a body of evidence that they could then use to talk to reporters, to talk to school board members, and say, this campaign comes out of community-based interest. A second piece that they engaged in was youth media engagement, where they trained young people to become more effective in interacting with reporters and talking about what stories they wanted to tell. And in fact, Jonathan Perez, who I mentioned before, is at the 2008 rally. During this campaign, I think it was in 10th or 11th grade, and he was quoted in one of the local papers talking about the fact that he didn't have access to the right courses to go to college, even though he wanted to be in a college prep curriculum. So he was on message, as were the young people that were quoted from other youth organizing groups as well. The young people also became effective persuaders. The United Way connected young people from inner city struggle with a set of business leaders and some members of the trades unions in like a cocktail party environment. As I wasn't there, but this is what has been reported to me. And the young people from inner city struggle explained their interest in college access and were so effective in telling their own stories that they won over at least this one group of business leaders and the trades. And so they then supported the campaign. They not only were neutral, but were in favor of it. Were not particularly active, but did not come out against. And then finally, there was a variety of different youth-led community outreach. One of the strategies they used was to take a map that they had, in effect, solicited from us. So they had seen some other maps that we had created that were highlighting inequalities in college outcomes and curricular offerings. And they said, can you do this for us, and point to East LA schools. So what this map shows is census tracts by race, where the brown areas here have the highest proportion of Latino and African American residents. And then these bars show the proportion of students at each of these different high schools that were either going on to high school graduation or to A through G eligibility. And these bubbles are the proportion of courses that were being offered that were A through G courses at the high schools. So the young people were able to take this map around and break it down. So they went to churches, they went door to door, they went to community meetings, showed this map, and it became a way for them both to show the knowledge and information that they had, but also to make this point very clearly that there's racial inequality that's playing out through our schools and it needs to be changed. This whole campaign then culminated in a series of mobilizations that finally hundreds of students showing up at the board for the final board vote in June of that year, where they ended up winning 6 of the 7 board members and having this resolution passed. So what power was built, and what are the takeaways from this? Well, there were some new policies that emerged. One of the new policies was new courses. The district directed high schools to initiate new courses that were more college preparatory in particular sorts of schools. They provided some new resources, although this was marginal. So making sure that there were science labs in schools that previously had not had enough science labs, or making these science lab carts available, which was better than what they had before, which was still dramatically inadequate. There also were new beliefs that emerged. So Maria Brenna said that before it went unchecked when school board members said not everyone should go to college. Now it's unpopular to say that. So kind of this understanding about what young people want, what young people deserve, dramatically changed. And finally, there were different sorts of relationships. So Maria Brenna's talked about the fact that when either public officials or principals and other school officials, they now recognize that youth can attract media attention and influence policy. They are a force to be reckoned with. So those sorts of relationships speak to the new forms of power that emerge. I also want to highlight some cautions here. Primarily that while things changed, they didn't change near as much as young people involved in this campaign had hoped. One of the reasons for this was it's easier to win a resolution than to implement a resolution. Like you can use mass mobilization as a way to transform votes. It's much harder once it gets into the bureaucracy to follow what's going to happen. And the youth organizing groups tried to sit on these task forces that were focused on implementation. It was very difficult to do. But probably the bigger problem that they faced was, just as this effort was gaining momentum, money began to be filtered out of the public education system over the last 3 or 4 years. And so the gains that had been won gradually had been lost again, and many of the schools continue to struggle, or struggle in different sorts of ways in a context of fiscal austerity. So let me turn now to this second campaign around the election of 2008. Now, elections are seeming to be a ripe opportunity for civic engagement, civic learning, and there's been some talk about this amongst scholars looking at what happens in public schools. There's been some big programs that have been trying to engage young people in public schools in learning in the context of elections. Surprisingly, not as much as one would think, but there's been some. There also has been some talk about community organizing groups engaging in electoral politics, but Peter Dreyer argues that Alinsky groups that come out of the Alinsky tradition have steered away to some extent from electoral politics because there's a sense within some community organizing groups that they don't want to create any permanent enemies or permanent friends, that they want to remain somewhat autonomous, and so they don't want to engage too much in electoral politics. One group that has been different is the group that used to be known as ACORN, that after the 2008 election was destroyed and now has come back under different names. But ACORN did have a history of, in part because of their labor background, of engaging in electoral politics. And engaging in electoral politics with some strategies that seemed to pay off. Having their members go door to door in communities that they knew, and that seemed to turn out the electorate in ways that had not previously been done. Also important for this, the 2008 election, was work that Lisa has done and has a new book coming out about, which suggests that when people go out in their local communities, when neighbors go out and know each other, do door knocking, face-to-face personal contact, that these strategies have proved successful, and they've proved particularly successful in turning out vote amongst young voters. Now, some of the youth organizing groups around California were involved in the California Votes Initiative, and one of those groups was Inner City Struggle. So, two different points about the way in which Inner City Struggle engaged in the 2008 election that are important. One is that they had this notion that we want to do electoral organizing, not electoral mobilizing. I'll read this quote in just one second. The other idea was to highlight the relationship between getting out the vote and racial justice. And I think those two dynamics really set apart what Inner City Struggle was doing from a lot of other work that was going on during the 2008 election. So you can't see the quote here, but it's Henry Perez, who's now the Associate Director of Inner City Struggle. He draws this very interesting distinction between voter mobilizing, in other words, just getting out people on this one-time basis, and voter organizing. He says, with voter mobilizing, you're visiting them around election time. And usually there's no follow-up with this type of work. You probably wouldn't visit them again until the next election comes around. With voter organizing, we want to create a model on how we engage voters in between the elections so that they are more engaged with the organization. They're more invested in the organization so that we can develop a common agenda, a common platform with our voter constituency. Now, a couple of things about what he says here I think are important. One is there's a sense in which voting enacts power in a collective way rather than voters as individuals being the powerful agents that's suggested here. I also think that there's a sense in which the community-based organization, this community organizing group, is the key player, he wants to suggest. They're the key ones who can communicate the community's interests as opposed to the political party. Right? So there's a different sensibility that I think he wants to point towards. And then the third piece that I think is important here is that electoral organizing opens the possibility that voting work can flow into and out of other organizing activities, other campaign work that organizing groups are engaged in. So voting doesn't have to be separate from or an alternative to protest. It can be one and the same. It can be part of this broader effort. So in addition to this, the electoral organizing, the other focus on racial justice is really intriguing. And the Inner City Struggle Group created what they called Electoral Justice 101. This was a workshop curriculum that they developed, which starts with, the very first lines in the workshop is, today we're going to talk about democracy and who's historically has had access to democracy. And they begin by kind of breaking down these two words, democracy and disenfranchisement, right? And they break down democracy and say its Greek roots are in this notion of power. And then they go through and walk young people through the history of disenfranchisement. Who's been disenfranchised in American history? Under what pretext? It concludes with what they call the Ballot of Justice activity. And what they do is they ask for a set of volunteers and they give them different identities. So one young person is given an identity as a white male. Another person was a Chicano male. Another was an Asian American immigrant. And they locate this in the South in the 1950s. They get each of them a marker and they tell them to step 15 feet back from this target. And then they say, take 2 steps back if. And then they begin to tell people to either go back or forward based on the structural privileges that they would have had given their identities at this moment, right? And so by the time these people throw their markers at the target, the only one that had a chance to hit the mark, to have their vote be counted, was the white male. And so the young people could see that structural forces were shaping the opportunities, even though it was presented as this fair game, right? So this is this way that popular education techniques become a powerful way to communicate these important messages about agency and structure and the relationship between them. So during this election period, young people participated in electoral politics in ways that were both about organizing and were about highlighting racial inequality. One way that this played out was that young people participated in determining which propositions that they would support, which measures they would support. So there was a participatory process of defining their agenda. Then they went out. This is a door knocker, what do you call it? Door hanger that they used. So for 4 consecutive Saturdays before the election, 40 young people went out in pairs and went door to door in their community. Oftentimes they faced dogs that were not particularly friendly. Sometimes on Saturday mornings they faced neighbors who didn't really want to be woken up at 9 a.m. Sometimes they encountered people who were not really interested in the election. But for the most part, they were extremely well received in their communities, and they touched 4,000 different households. Now, the 40 students did this along with 10 different parents who were part of Inner City Struggle and a set of different staff members too. But across the group, they touched 4,000 different voters, 80% of whom ended up voting, which was an extraordinary high turnout for the East LA community. What sort of lessons emerged for the young people? Well, in part, young people learned a lot about procedurally what happens during elections. And so this is a discussion about election night where a young girl, Veronica, says, I was actually glued to the TV on election night. They get the numbers, they're still counting votes. This is Ricardo kind of doing play-by-play of election night. Oh, we're up, oh no. And Veronica says, my parents were like, how do you know about this? I just told them, and they're like, oh wow. The young people, in describing the election afterwards, knew exactly what the propositions were. They knew when a proposition had been challenged legally, under what pretext. So they had a deep understanding of the electoral process as well as the substantive issues that were being raised, and a deep commitment in being glued to the TV. A second thing that was reflected in their comments after the election is a sense of how to engage in civic dialogue in powerful ways. Ricardo says most people, if they're against you or think differently, sometimes you can try to reason with them and sometimes you can't. Well, most of the time, what I've seen that works is logic. So yeah, it teaches a lot of communication with people with different ways of talking. And Veronica, I think importantly, says she wasn't really comfortable talking to strangers before the election, but I knew what I was going to say. And beating them to the point when they were going to say, oh, but children should be charged as adults. Just beating them to it and telling them why it's negative, they'll be like, oh, okay. So this was a 15-year-old who had kind of come to these deeper understandings about how to engage in civic dialogue. Also reflected in their comments is a critical understanding about the discursive process that surrounds elections and the ways in which electoral politics are often trying to serve certain sorts of political interests. So Jose talking about he says one of the state propositions was called the Safe Neighborhoods Act, which gave more money to prisons, took more money away from our schools or healthcare. So that's how they get your vote, by fooling you with language. Yeah, because if you see Safe Neighborhoods Act, everybody's going to want to vote for that, but they don't really know what's behind it, which is more jails. Less money for healthcare, less money for schools. Jose says, so they are making sick neighborhoods. So you can kind of see a deep critical analysis emerging. Also reflected in this, and reflected in some of their other comments, is a sense of power, that they get it, that they can see beneath the froth and foam that are being put forth as real politics. Then there's a set of civic identities that emerged in the context of the election too. One is the identity as young people who were informing their neighbors, their parents, their coaches, their teachers. And so Alex says, once you go out for the first couple of times, you get a sense of how people are so uninformed. They don't know what's this and they don't know what that is. Once you realize what it's really about and what a big effect it can have on you, you start realizing, how could people just ignore this? So you try to put yourself out there and try to make an effort to let people know what you think. The young people talked about becoming role models and becoming community leaders. Beyond these quotes, on a couple different occasions, young people said that when they went into to the homes of their neighbors, the parents often called in their other kids and said, "Hey, look at what he's doing. You should be doing this too." So, and they also talked about really inspiring their younger siblings. So Liz says, we inspire other people, the young people, to start getting involved with their community and seeing how a successful organization has many victories. They get involved, they say, oh, well, I want to join something like that one and make a difference. Now, the second comment from Jorge was one that I heard a couple times, where the stereotypes that they had so often heard about people from their community as people who were disinterested were directly being challenged by their actions, right? It takes away the negative stereotypes that they have about us students. We're spending our Saturday time helping our community. People are really shocked and amazed at how much students do. I mean, you don't see that in the news. And I think this relates probably to some of the media workshops that they've done as well. And finally, I wanted to close this discussion of the electoral engagement with a caution that came as they were describing, or they were asked the question, how does what you do in your work in the inner city struggle relate to anything you did in your classrooms around the election? So Ricardo says, some teachers, sometimes they badmouth this, or they say something about that. Sometimes you disagree or agree with them, but I just don't say anything. So he was talking about, just very minimal conversations about the elections. Veronica's comment, I find even more need to engage with. So he says, well, we actually talked about all the propositions before the elections, and it was two classes, our class plus another class, and they just show a big overview of all the propositions, and then some people are like, oh yes, no on 6. Or some people are like, oh yes, it's good that they should be tried as adults, because they did this, or they should know the consequences. So it was just debate. Now, this is the same young lady who was talking before about not being comfortable engaging in dialogue and then doing that in such an effective way. So for her to say it's just debate speaks to the way that somehow her school managed to take all the energy out of this civic learning opportunity. And it raises real questions about how schools can draw upon the ways in which these community-based organizations are. We reached 12 different youth organizing groups, or groups that included youth. 11 of those 12 said that they participated in the election, and the one that didn't participate acknowledged that they would have, but they had a staff problem that fall. So almost all the youth organizing groups were somehow engaged in the election. Most of them, 10 out of the 11, worked on the state propositions, particularly 6 and 9. Some were also working on Proposition 8, which was a key proposition during that election. Related to gay marriage, and then more than half worked on local school bonds. Almost all the organizations said that they chose these based on some social justice criteria. 9 of the 11 talked about educational justice, but oftentimes they were thinking about issues around justice as a way to think about what to focus on. And then a variety of different forms of participation played out across the different groups. So almost all participated in voter registration. Almost all the young people read and discussed ballot initiatives. Attending rallies was also popular, and door knocking, etc. Okay. Finally, I wanted to share some very preliminary findings from this study that Veronica Triquez and I are doing that looks at how young people who participate in youth organizing while in high school, what happens to them as they enter young adulthood. And this study is nested in a broader study that Veronica Triquez, who's a USC sociology professor, is doing, where she did a random sample survey of 2,500 young adults, 18 to 25. Some of you may have been contacted. That asked them about their education, their work experience, and their civic engagement. And so, in addition to that random sample, we also done a targeted sample of young people who were participants in youth organizing groups when they were in high school. 8 different youth organizing groups that have been around for at least 10 years was the way that we created that criteria. So what I'm reporting on today is partial responses. So we've done about 300 of the surveys of the youth organizing alums. We're going to end up doing about 500 of them. All of the random sample has been completed. Now, what I'm going to share with you today is a comparison of young people who were involved in youth organizing groups who report that they were in families with low income while they were in high school. So these are young people who both received free and reduced lunch and were eligible for some other federal assistance or federal or state assistance during the time while they were in high school. So 88% of the youth organizing groups were low income while in high school. Only 39% of the random sample were low income while they were in high school, but I'm going to be comparing the gold and the gold, if that makes sense. So young people who were in similar economic circumstances. So comparing those two groups, the youth organizing alums far more likely to report that they volunteered in the last year than their peers. 70% of them report as opposed to 41% of all alums. They also report being more civically engaged. So one marker that we asked them, have you worked with others on issues that affect your community in the last year? So about 3 times as likely to report yes to that. A little more than twice as likely to report that they've used the internet to share political perspective with other young people. And I didn't say before, but many of the youth organizing groups in the context of the 2008 election used the internet for similar purposes. And then have they produced, this is probably the least surprising, that they're 4 times as likely as other youth in the state to say that, other young adults in the state to say that they've participated in a protest or march in the last year. And then finally, if they were eligible to vote, did they vote in the 2010 midterm election? So these numbers are lower than they would be probably for a presidential election year, but we see a difference for the youth organizing alumni. And again, these numbers are sure to change as our survey comes in. So finally, I wanted to close with one image and one quote. The image is from a rally that came after the A through G campaign. I think this was the 3rd or 4th anniversary of that campaign. And I wanted to share this because I think some people see that sign, all power to the students, and think and kind of dismiss it. That there can be a tendency to say, well, protest activity can be a bunch of sound and fury and there's not much understanding behind it. And one example of this is a quote I'm hoping to find, yes, by sometimes adversary of inner city struggle on the school board, a guy named David Tarkovsky in LA, who after inner city struggle won their campaign, he said, the civic engagement part of what they're doing is really great, but I wonder about whether they're learning to deal with the unavoidable complexities of civic and political life. Now, I think Tarkovsky failed to understand all of the learning that was going on beneath the protest activity that he did see. And I think he also was not able to understand that when young people say all power to the students, they're conceiving of power in a very different sort of way. In a way that doesn't mean I have mine and you don't get that. It's more of an inclusive way. In fact, at this same rally, there were many parents who were carrying signs that said, "All power to the students." Now, the best articulation of this different understanding of power and different understanding of democracy came from Luis Sanchez, who was the director of inner city struggle in the early part of the 2000s. And this is just an off-the-cuff interview I'd done with him in 2004, where this powerful thing he had to say. He said, there are two versions of democracy. There's the democracy where you vote people in, and once they get in, you have no real power. It's up to the elected to use their position for good or bad. The other version of democracy is that people who are voted into power are representative of a constituency. And it's their job to be accountable to the people who put them in power, or the people who didn't put them in. In that view of civil society, everyday democracy should be people doing surveys, people doing protests. A day when people are not organizing, there will not be true democracy. And I think what Luis Sanchez understood, Luis Sanchez, I should note, Berkeley grad, who tells me that most of his time at Berkeley was spent honing his organizing skills. But what he understood was that civil society is built in the process of organizing activities, and that youth organizing groups at their best have the capacity to build power in a different sort of way, and to build democratic skills in a different sort of way that can be transformed. Thank you very much.
We have about 10 minutes. Do you want to run your own Q&A?
Sure.
Throw it open for folks to ask.
So I commented on the bar graphs at the end, and so help me understand, the goal was from students who had access to those organizing opportunities, or who actually participated in them. Like, what I guess I'm asking is that the intent to treat effect, or the treatment of the treated effect? Are you, when you go through the outcomes of people who...
Try to remember what the goal was.
Keep going.
The low income having done youth organizing, and the low income having not done, right?
Yeah, just from the
Those
random
goals.
sample, and then the targeted sample. Is the
Yes.
targeted sample people who had access to the organizing, or who actually participated in it?
So we are going to know more about that through the follow-up interviews that we're doing. What we've done is to go back to the groups and get their lists of members, and then use those to sample from.
Okay.
So the extent to which these members, so before I was saying that youth organizing groups often say we have core members, we have active members, and we have mobilized. These would either be core or active members. So these are people who participated in workshops, whether they were members of the core or not. I'll have a better sense of as our follow-up interviews come in.
But they're not just students at the high school.
No. These are
there's
are
some
people
selection
who are
in these
members.
categories. That
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, early 80% that went out knocking on doors. I was wondering how much of that, and that's phenomenal, how much do you think that could have been a comparison factor that younger kids were involved? You know what I'm saying? Get back on the thing I'm going at. You know, instead of like it was adults going out and knocking on doors, I was kind of curious if it would have been like 60%. I just kind of think it's an embarrassment factor that kids are out there doing it, so people are they're talking to it, that kind of energizes them to get out and vote. You know what I'm trying to say?
I think there was some of the quotes from the young people suggest that they were treated differently because they were from the local community, but also because they were showing that they were committed, right? And I think being 15 and showing your commitment when you can't even vote yourself, I think has a certain power that comes with it. In a different sort of way, but I think important too in East LA, some of the parent members, some of whom are not documented, have participated in these outreach activities, and I think it has been important to them to be able to say, I can't vote myself, so I'm going out and making sure that enough of our community is represented in this vote. So I think that also has a certain moral force that in some ways parallels the moral force that young people have.
We had an experiment in Calusa that had overwhelming response, and that's what it was. Folks who just hadn't become citizens, but were in the citizenship classes, saying, you need to vote for me because I can't, and it's really important that you do it. Yeah, so I think that's part of it. Any final? Where's Ruben? He's always our good question. You bet. There you go. Okay, well, please join me in thanking John for a I'd like to thank my staff, Becky Alexander, Rosa Rodriguez, Alejandro Jimenez, and Christy Chong, who made today possible. And I'd like to invite you to join us for a reception in the parlor. Immediately after, there's food, and lots of food, and an opportunity to continue the conversation. Thanks.